Welcome back. Now, total employment edged lower in March, down 0.7% quarter on quarter, and on a year-on-year basis, employment fell 0.9%. This as jobs were shared in trade, community services, mining, business services, construction and electricity. Nthabiseng Moleko, development economist from the Stellenbosch Business School, joins us with her assessment of the print. And Nthabiseng, thanks so much for your time this afternoon. Now, economists were expecting a contraction on a quarter-on-quarter basis. So the 0.7% drop in formal jobs not coming as a surprise, especially against the Q1 GDP numbers.
Absolutely. So I think unemployment, when you look at it, is directly linked to the levels of productivity in a country and the level of total output. So when we start to see that contraction in the economic activity, particularly in the different sectors that you have just mentioned, we have seen not much disposable income in households. That is not a surprise then to see trade contracting by 194,000. It's not a surprise that we are not seeing the movement on the construction front. And particularly with the deindustrialization, you find that both utilities, construction and manufacturing have been on a downward trajectory for the last decade. I think when you see the contraction again in terms of the lack of boisterous productivity, private households are not employing as many people because income is really not sufficient. And that comes to both also the community and social services and mining services. We have seen mining on a downward trajectory, and particularly the level of employment coming in from the primary sectors over the last 2 decades has considerably declined. I think the pocket of interest is really to say that some provinces are harder hit than others. And I think in the last quarter, we've observed that some provinces have, for instance, KwaZulu-Natal and Eastern Cape combined have seen the biggest drops, more than Northwest Limpopo, Mpumalanga, Northern Cape. 104,000 jobs lost in KwaZulu-Natal. Eastern Cape at over 83,000. This is significant for already high levels of unemployment in those provinces where there's economic already depravity. So there's serious concerns about the continuing downward trajectory of unemployment, the continuing inability of our economy to absorb the unemployed, but further to that, the concentration in the youth, and particularly women in the rural areas, and in particularly those who should be economically productive in these years, and they are not sufficiently being absorbed, and something has to be done in response to that.
It's also been interesting to see how the optimism around the GNU that we saw post-June last year not really playing out in the real economy, and we're not necessarily seeing change, because even when you look on a year-on-year basis, we are still seeing declines in employment. And also looking at prints like business confidence, we're still seeing a decline in morale. I think it was stable, the RMB Business Confidence Index, that is. Are we just seeing businesses, employers just really waiting for real change and real economic growth before, making those big moves?
What informs a change in economic output is the strategy. What informs the change in economic outcomes is the management of your economic institutions. What therefore will inform a change, not just in business confidence, but in the outcomes, is together with the ideological shift in terms of making sure that we are not merely going to rely on, I would say, the market forces. South Africa has a critical issue of market failure, an inability for the economy as it stands. If you focus merely on the market, the labor market outcomes, we have an inability of attrition, or what we call the absorption rate. That means that every year, year on year, you have an additional approximately 1.23 million people added to the labor market and the labor force. Of those, we are unable to make sure that they're actively employed in the labor force. We have a very low labor or an employment intensity. And that requires very deliberate action by policymakers, by our instruments in terms of the state, and also the other, whether it's the state-owned enterprises, whether it's the DFIs that come in to assist with SMME development. All these market failures that result in the current situation, if we do not respond very decisively, very deliberately through deploying different strategies and different impact assessments of our institutions, we will see the same outcomes. So I think that when you talk to why are things still the same, if we talk about the results and we don't implement measures to implement different outcomes, we will get the same results even in the next quarter. If we don't make sure that we align our industrial policy to have labor intensity or our agricultural policies to improve our output and our total factor productivity in the rural areas and where we see outward migration because of the economic desert or wilderness that is in those areas, we will still see an increase in discouraged work seekers, particularly in the youth, which we just saw now, rising up by more than 7,000 people. That has to be coming from a change in the strategy. We cannot deploy the same instruments and say it's going to result in different outcomes. Let's change the instruments if we want different outcomes. Let's put a strategy together that has labor intensity and deploying public employment programs, deploying industrialization, deploying rural development as an underpinning framework, deploying capital market opening to SMMEs that are excluded. That requires us to be very deliberate. Let's coordinate our instruments and our financial institutions so that we can deploy capital to these sectors that we're seeing are decreasing.
That's interesting, Nthabiseng, because we're also chatting to the Minister of Small Business Development later on in the show, so I'll definitely pose some of those questions to her. Thanks so much for your time and joining us and unpacking that print for us. That was Nthabiseng Moleko, Development Economist from the Stellenbosch Business School.